Okay, so we're back with Lee Fields here, and we're talking about mixing and putting
Jay
together
Cody.
the mix, and me, Jay Cody. And so we're here talking about the mix, and we just got done putting together some drums and the bass and the guitars and a lot of loops and tracks and things. And so now we're switching songs. We're going to redo it. This song's got a little bit different kind of vibe. It's still pretty high energy, but a lot more electronic synth kind of driven. And we've got some vocals that we're going to work with. And so we've already put together the mix of the drums and things, but so now we're going to talk about working on vocals and kind of getting that effect going on. So we want to talk about that?
Yeah, so we probably should have started with vocals because worship, it's the most important part, right? So if it was just a band up there, it would be difficult to sing. So vocals, this song is more of a worship song. It's and this is a church band at Bayside. So a little different. The vocal is a KSM9 microphone on a live stage, so you're going to hear a bleed, you're going to hear some good mic technique, some not so good mic technique, just lots of stuff. So we'll throw the vocal up and
again with this song, I mean it's similar in the fact that it's still kind of high energy, and we still kind of have the same goal of creating this experience and really getting everybody out of their seat and really excited to sing and so the mix is still really high energy, really you have that really heavy percussive in there, but again we've created room for the vocal to kind of cut through. So
all right, here we go.
Our God saved, our God reigns. We lift you up, let it be new.
Okay, so the first thing we notice is it's pretty dark. Proximity effect with the microphone, the closer you get to it, the more low frequency buildup you have. That's definitely there. That's a condenser microphone, so that is exaggerated with that mic. So very first, we're going to throw high pass filter on just to clean that up.
Voice again, oh. No need for fear and shame. There's power in his name. Come on, let freedom reign. Let it be known that our God saved.
Cool, so a lot of that stuff's cut out, but there's still some low mid stuff. I'm just going to carve away.
Be known that love has come, love has won. We lift you up.
I think it's really interesting what you did right there. I saw you on the EQ. You kind of boosted and swept around a little bit. What were you trying to do there by boosting?
I'm just I would call it fishing for what frequencies I'm hearing that's kind of muddy. So this is really dangerous to do live. You should not do this live. It should only be in a virtual scenario like this or sound check. But even in sound check on a live mic, you will have feedback, so you have to be very, very careful. But I just boosted and then move around until I find the muddy stuff right in there, and then turn it down. Just like that.
So that's pretty interesting. So we talked about the low end buildup, the proximity effect. The closer that you get to the mic, the more low end that's actually kind of building up. So I see that you're compensating that. One, you got the high pass filter in, so a lot of that bass and other things bleeding on the stage isn't getting through. Most of the vocal isn't that low anyway. But then you just took that big chunk of low mid out, maybe to the point that it's a little thin. But I think what you're probably going for is that a lot of our intelligibility and the diction and our transients are much higher up frequency-wise, and that's really what we want to make sure cuts through.
Correct. Yep, that's exactly right. And I don't necessarily like boosting frequencies on a vocal. You can. I like to avoid it. This microphone's pretty bright, so we're using it because a lot of that stuff is already there, especially after we cut a lot of the low end out. It's pretty bright. If needed, I'll sometimes do just a shelf on top, again, really high, 10K, 8K, if we need it. I don't think we're going to, but sometimes I'll do that.
So you'll go through and actually pick the mic for the singer and try and get one that kind of features their voice in a specific way ahead of time?
Kind of. Limited resources with a church, you can't always do that, right? So we picked a microphone that's most like a studio condenser. It's just a really good utility knife. It works on a lot of different people. So we have a bunch of the same kind. So that's what we did there. Yeah, I mean, If budget's no option, sure, you can match a microphone to a singer, and that's probably ideal. But I would say church scenario, you're going to end up with a situation somewhat like this. Okay, so EQ's pretty good. I'm going to throw compression on it now, and then it may or may not cause some tonal changes that will need to go back to EQ, but we'll see. I'm going to use premium rack, the U76, and I've kind of already dialed in some presets here, but I'm going to use the all buttons in. And this specific model of compressor, it's modeling the vintage 1176. The all button was actually not on the original unit. It was something that was found if you press all 4 ratio buttons in at the same time. It actually is reproducing all 4 of those ratios at once. It wasn't something new. It was actually all 4 of those. I have a really quick release on it because with vocals, all the information that's coming through, I want it to release as fast as possible. With a medium attack, it's not too aggressive. And we'll throw it up here.
We lift your name up higher and higher. We lift your name up.
Here's with it off.
We shout his name now, louder and louder. We shout it out now, sing, let it be known. Come on.
So what I'm trying to do there is limit his dynamics, but at the same time, it almost is like the vocal on stage just got closer to my face at the same time. So it's limiting the dynamics, but by doing that, the perception is that the vocal actually comes forward in the mix.
The other thing too about this track is, I mean, so I know the guy singing it, he's playing guitar, he's kind of jumping around on stage trying to get everybody into it. So there's a lot of error in there, not necessarily just with him singing, but he's kind of jumping around and the mic is on a boom. So you're also just trying to limit the physical distance going back and forth between the mic and the proximity effect there too.
Correct.
So that's another kind of advantage of using the compressor there with that quick of a release especially.
Yeah. And there's not a ton of drum bleed here. There's a little bit, especially when he moves off the mic, you'll hear the drums get louder. That's just a part of a live sound. It's tough. I'm pretty certain that there's even a drum shield on this drum kit.
But the big thing that you guys have probably done is as the lead singer, not putting the drums exactly behind him. The drums are probably off to the side or somewhere to try and limit that bleed in there.
Yeah.
For all the world to hear, oh, 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 there's love for everyone.
Okay, so that's that. I'm going to just throw up, I haven't added any effects to his vocal yet, but I'm going to pull back in the band mix and just listen and make sure the vocal is setting where I want it to, and then I'll throw some effects on the vocal.
God has won. We lift you up, Nothing can stop us now. No one can keep us down.
So it's pretty good. I can understand what he's saying. Everything's good. So now I'm going to add some effects.
So, I mean, when we're talking about effects on vocals, we're probably most commonly talking about reverb. What's your kind of general first go at rule of reverb on vocals? Because it's probably a little bit different than reverb on snare or toms.
It is. Reverb on vocals is awesome. It can be great or it can be bad. So you really have to be careful with the kinds of reverbs you use. But in general, I think reverb in a live setting on a vocal is, I hesitate to say it, but I almost want to say mandatory. It depends on the genre, sure, but with what we're doing and the type of experience that we're trying to create, adding reverb to the vocal makes it envelop the room, and it's a more immersive experience. You need to play with it to see what I'm saying, but when the energy level in the room is at a certain point and the vocal is dry, it's just coming right down the center of the room. As soon as you add reverb to it brings a whole new life to the vocal. It almost becomes superhuman-ish. So when I'm not creating a vocal sound, but when we're processing the vocal and treating it, that kind of is a goal, for it to almost be superhuman and be larger than life, really big, and again, back to the immersive experience. So with reverb, with delays, which we'll talk about after that. And with all the vocals, really, especially the one thing you can't avoid is if you turn the vocal up in the room, there's reflections that are happening in the room already. So it can't be just completely dry. But I think the amount of reverb you use, the length of the reverbs, all of that help create and add to the experience you're trying to create. So we are using a plate reverb, and it is set to 3.1 seconds. And don't focus on as much the amount of time, because some people would say that's long, or some people may think that's short. It's really the amount you send to it. So I'm going to throw up the vocal, and then we'll add in the verb.
All right, lift your voices. Come on, let's turn it up. We're gonna sing it out for all the world to hear. Oh, 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 oh. There's love for everyone. A new day has begun. Something to shout about. Let it be.
Okay, so now there's also some parameters in the delay that are really important. First is the initial delay. You can actually create distance between the delay of the vocal and the original source itself. If it's at 0, it tends to get washed together, and there's not really a lot of separation. But you can use longer reverb on vocals, especially when you use this initial delay, or sometimes you'll see it called pre-delay. I'm going to go all the way to 90 milliseconds, which is pretty far. Let's see if we'll turn it off. It's at 0, and then I'll roll it up to 90. And you can actually hear the vocal, again, almost the perception of it kind of separating and coming forward in the mix, but still being in the big, wide reverb sound.
We lift you up, let it be known.
So here I'll roll it up.
Love has come, love has won. We lift you up, oh.
So that just puts separation.
Sing church, we lift your name. We lift your name up higher and higher. We lift your name.
So that's a 0. That's a 0, and it's more swimmy, more washy. So just adding a bunch of pre-delay just separates that a bit. Then we also have high-pass filter and low-pass filter on these, and these are going to be really, really important to have these set appropriate. So I'm going to crank this up, the low-pass, just to off.
We shout it out there, sing, let it be known. Come on.
So the reverb tail just got a lot brighter, so we want to darken that up a bit so that it's not as, you can't really pick it out as much. So I'm going to go back to 8K.
We lift you up, let it be known. Then
You can hear the tail there get a little darker. And then same thing with a high-pass filter. If you go too high,
has come, love has won.
it loses all of its body. So we'll go back 140.
We lift you up, oh my.
Okay. The rest of the parameters, there's different things: room size, decay, diffusion. I like this particular one. The way it comes up, the preset on it's really good. I usually just tweak the high pass, low pass, and the time to suit, and the delay. These are really pretty solid, but it wouldn't hurt to play around with those and figure out what they do. So
I noticed you did a couple of things there that kind of enabled you to actually maybe use more reverb and kind of cheat and get away with it. One of them was using the pre-delay, the initial delay.
Yeah. And
like you talked about, it separates the verb from the vocal enough to where you still hear the vocal intelligibly, and maybe you can kind of sneak some more verb in there because it's not compromising to the integrity of the vocal. But then you talked about making the reverb darker and kind of taking off some of that little bright part of the high end, where we'll be a little bit more sensitive to. So in making that a little darker, you again can kind of get away with more. So that's pretty interesting.
Yep. So I'm going to turn it back up, and again, by itself, it could be argued that that's a lot of verb, but we'll listen to it in the context with the band and then decide.
No need for fear and shame. There's power in His name. Come on. That I got saved.
Okay, so I'm just going to turn the verb off so you can hear it in the mix, without, and then with it. We'll go. Okay, so this will be off, and then I'll just pop it on.
Sing it, church, we lift your name. We lift your name up higher and higher. We lift your name up. We shout your name now, louder and louder. We shout it out now. We lift your name up.
So to me, it's a lot more exciting. It is bigger, and it's all of that, but it's also more interesting, and it's like, it just makes me kind of go, oh, okay. To me, that's just a cool thing. To me, it feels like the vocal sits in the mix better. It's not like a separate thing. Now it all feels kind of glued together.
Is there ever a point where how can you tell if there's too much reverb? Is there a defining moment?
Sure, I think when it's distracting, when you go, wow, that's a lot of reverb. I think as soon as you know that, then it's probably too much. Let's turn a bunch of it on.
The love has come, love has won. We lift you up.
So that's a lot, right?
Yeah.
I'm going to get that set again.
Come on, make some noise for yeah!
Okay. So there's vocal verb. And then we have delay. So this is kind of fun and kind of dangerous also. A lot of times when people figure out how to do delay, especially tap delay, everyone else in the church knows it also, that they've found it. So the tendency is that after every 4 bars, they do the Jimmy Eat World echo. As soon as you found, oh, I can echo that word, and then I can echo that word, and I can echo that word. And it becomes, instead of a tool to help the vocal sound better, it becomes like this neat trick, and we do it all the time. And that's not good. I was probably definitely guilty of that for the first, until yesterday. Probably not that, but a long time. So same idea, we're just using a mono delay, just like we were using the reverb as an effect. We've just inserted another one using an aux to feed it, and we've set a tap tempo. So now I can control the delay of the vocal. So here is the vocal with a delay set on quarter note.
Let it be known that love has come, love has won. We lift you up,
Okay, so the delay, there's lots of different parameters, just like on reverb, and they're really, really important. So the first thing that stuck out to me was the delay. The delay actually sticks out too much. So what we're going to do is almost create like an AM radio effect. We're going to turn on a high pass pretty high and a low pass. We're going to bring it down pretty low so that we're really only getting a muffled sound almost. It'll almost kind of sound like a AM radio. And by rolling the low pass down and high pass up. Something like that. So I'll turn the high pass back, or the low pass back up. And back down. And I'm also going to send it to the reverb. So instead of using it, like we were talking about, as an effect, an echo, I'll actually leave it tucked in the mix the whole time. And it'll actually change dynamically, creatively, throughout the song. So in the verse, maybe it's lower. In the chorus, maybe it's louder. So it'd be something like this.
All right, lift your voices. Come on, let's turn it up. We're gonna sing it out for all the world to hear. Oh, 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 oh. There's love for everyone. A new day has begun. Something to shout about. Let it be known that our God saved, our God raised.
So it's not really noticeable there. It's definitely adding a texture and thickening the vocal. If I just turn the band off, you'll definitely hear it. So you hear it there for a good 2 or 3 more seconds.
So an interesting effect there. You did a couple of things there that I thought was really interesting. One, by leaving that delay kind of in the mix, but not to where you can't hear it with everything going, but you can definitely hear it by itself. It's almost extending those long notes that he says, and it's kind of carrying it with it. So it almost kind of carries that tone.
Yep.
Which is kind of cool. The other thing is, again, similar to the reverb, you're darkening that delay so that, one, it's not distracting. You could hear it when you had that low pass off. Every time he had an S or a T, that would get repeated, as well as his vowel sounds, which is not really what you want repeated. You want the vowel sounds to extend the voice, but you don't necessarily want as many of those consonants to repeat it, because this isn't like an echo where we're trying to do a call and respond. It's more of just filling in, like you said,
Right.
those gaps.
You don't want it to be a percussive instrument, because it can quickly become that.
That's really good, yeah.
And then the tempo, right now it's set to quarter note, but a lot of times I'll go to a triplet just to have some separation. So if a song has a lot of eighth notes, like this song actually in the chorus, we'll experiment with this, but a song like Our God, it's very quarter note, eighth note driven. The tendency is to want to do the delay the same, but it can almost get lost, especially if your tempo's right on, it almost kind of goes away. So doing like a triplet, and there's no other triplets happening, but doing that can really thicken the vocal up. So let's do the verse, and I'll change it to a triplet and then an eighth note so you can hear the differences. Okay, so that's eighth note. Now I'll change it to a triplet. So now it's a triplet.
Come on, make some noise, but yeah!
So I'll switch it here between triplet and eighth notes.
Alright, lift your voices. Come on, let's turn it up. We're gonna sing it out for all the world to hear. Oh, 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 oh. There's a
Now we're at eighth notes.
A new day has begun. Something to shout about.
Did you notice how it kind of got lost when it was eighth notes? We didn't change the volume, but it almost went away a little bit. But when it was triplets, there's some separation, it breaks up. I'll do that again on the chorus. Now it's back to triplets.
Nothing can stop us now. No one can keep us down. We found our voice again. Oh, oh, oh.
Back to eight.
No need for fear and shame. There's power in his name. Come on, let freedom reign. Let it be known that our God.
Yeah, so it's almost like the quarters they're playing on time, but they're also coming when the band is hitting as well.
Right.
As we're with the triplets, they're filling in a little bit of that dead space
Exactly.
in between. That's really good.
It almost thickens the mix up.
Yeah.
I like it better with the triplets when everything's so syncopated. I like to break it up a little bit.
That's really interesting. Another thing that you can do along a similar line is, let's say the song is in 3/4. You can actually do a dotted quarter note on your delay setting so that it actually stays in time with the 3/4 time signature instead of 4/4.
Yep.
And you can do a similar effect there as well with your tapping. So
A lot of records have that. So if you listen to the delay on records, most of the time they're not in sync with the rhythm. They're usually something off, a dotted eighth. Maybe there's a stereo one, and this one's a triplet, and this one's a dotted eighth. They do different things. Yep.
Awesome.
So I'm using another delay. I call it 260 only for the reason that I have it set to a quarter note at 260 beats a minute, and for me it acts as a doubler. I like to use it on slow ballads. We'll be able to hear it here, but when the song really needs that syncopated delay and you still want something else to fill in, this doubler really thickens the vocal a bit. So we'll listen to it by itself first. And
We lift you up. Oh,
so you heard a little bit there.
come on, make some noise with you. Yeah.
So while that's circling back around, we have the same EQ controls here, and it's set pretty high. So I'm going to go ahead and darken it up now, down to about 8K. We'll see what that sounds like, and about 400. And again, 260 beats a minute. This is not tied to the tap.
Come on, let's turn it up. We're gonna sing it out for all the world to hear. Oh, 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 oh. There's love for everyone.
Here's without it.
It has begun. Something to shout about. Let it be known.
Here's with it.
Take our gatherings. We lift you up. Let it be known.
And here's with it in the mix.
Love as one. We lift you up. Nothing can stop us now. No one can keep us down. We found our voice again. Oh, 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 oh. No need.
So I noticed you were doing something there. When we're listening to the song, we were just in the chorus. You actually had the delay up a little bit more, and as it transitioned into the verse, you kind of pulled it back a little bit.
Yeah.
So you're telling me that you actually have to use the faders and mix too?
It's the craziest thing. These faders, you have to change them.
Man. If only there was some kind of way.
Yeah, no. I'm definitely moving stuff all the time, especially vocal effects. So usually and if you notice, I actually returned both effects returns to inputs beside the vocal because I'm using them all the time. So for me, it doesn't make sense for them to be on a different layer or somewhere else. It's just as much a part of that instrument as his voice, so I want them right beside each other. So now we can listen to, we have the vocal, we have reverb, we have a tap delay, and we have the doubler, and we listen to them all together. And then what I'll do is I'll shut all the effects off so you can hear the difference.
We shout it out. Sing. Let it be known. Come on. We lift you up. Let it be known. We lift you up. Let it be known. That our God saves, our God reigns. We lift you up. Let it be known. That love has come, love has won. We lift you up.
Yep, so there's with on and off. So big difference to me. It's kind of boring, awesome.
We always want awesome.
Yeah.
Nice. Well, cool. So, so now that we've kind of talked about vocals and the effects, what if we have a second vocal? What if we wanted to blend two vocals together? I mean, so in this case, they're singing harmonies of each other. They're not singing unison. But at some points, maybe you will have folks singing unison. So how do you approach background vocals and processing them?
I like to treat background vocals as another texture, not necessarily it's not a lead guitar playing, it's not even the lead vocal singing, it's just a texture. It's you can hear the pitch and the intonation, but maybe not necessarily all the inflections and characteristics of the voice. So to me, I know that it's right when I can hear it and it's just a texture, just like the effects are on the lead vocal. I would treat a background vocal the same, and we have one. So I'm going to just quickly do some work here, and then we'll throw it up and blend it in. Just a little bit of compression. And throw some verb on it. Probably not as much as on the lead vocal.
Let it be known.
Okay, so here's our lead vocal, dry.
Gotta praise. We lift you up, let it be known that love has come, love has won. We lift you up, up. Sing it, church, we lift your name, we lift your name.
So a lot like that. He'll come back around on the chorus and we'll play it, but just so it's just barely in as a texture, not a like a highlighted instrument. Especially with modern worship, when we listen to the records, they do really the same thing.
Yeah, let's listen to it first.
Higher, we lift your name up. We shout your name now. Louder and louder. We shout it out. Sing, let it be you. Come on.
Yeah.
So sometimes we'll get background singers that, because singing background is actually a lot different than singing lead, right? You actually sing with a lot less of your signature sound and vibrato, and you actually almost kind of back off and really go for those vowel sounds as more of a supporting role and a lot less of that diction like you were talking about.
Yeah.
If you got someone who either is having a hard time pulling that back or just really keeping their own personality and their voice to a minimum, is there anything that we can do on the console that fixes that, or is that just an adult conversation?
I think it's an adult conversation. No, there's nothing you can do on the console to make people sing better. That's for sure. And if people could, churches would make Yamaha rich. So no, there really isn't. And that goes back to the relational part. And really, that's not the role of the front of house engineer to make or be responsible for those decisions. That should be on the worship leader or the program director or whoever's in charge of that. But if it's being detrimental, then that is a conversation to be had for sure. But no, nothing in the console is going to fix that. Microphones are dumb. They're going to pick up what they pick up regardless of anything. So yeah, that's it. A lot of times, if you're ever able to be in the studio when background vocals are being cut, it is hilarious to listen to the producer coach them on enunciations, because like you said, it's lay off of the S's and T's, and they're really going for those long vowel sounds, and they will actually edit them to where they are just punching in a vowel sound sometimes. It's quite funny. If you heard background vocals from famous records soloed up, they sound hysterical because it's just this texture for the vocal. Now, if it's a Southern Gospel quartet, way different. But for this genre of music, what we're talking about, that's why it works best.
That's really good. Awesome. So we've talked about drums, we've talked about guitars, and so one other interesting detail on this song is that it's very synth driven. A lot of the stuff that we used typically do in contemporary worship is very guitar driven. We're kind of there's a little bit of a morph and a shift there where the guitars are still a big part, but we're getting a lot more synths, we're getting a lot more tracks and loops. So this song in particular, you may notice that there's a lot of synth in there, and the synth is kind of carrying a lot of the song. How do you deal with, an instrument like a synth, which is usually kind of more high frequencies, there's not a lot of body and melody to it, making that the feature without losing all like your pitch reference, right? And keeping that guitar in there, but to where the guitar is not overpowering the synth.
Yeah, so the good news is the rhythm guitar on here is taking up that space that the synth necessarily isn't. So if we listen to the rhythm, this guy, and we listen to the loop, there's a big hole in the low mids there. And the guitar is really picking up the slack there. Wait for it to play. Here we go. So we listen to that in the mix. I'll leave the rhythm guitar off and then just pop it back in the mix. So to answer the question, it's relying on the other instruments to help fill that. And luckily, when the song was composed or arranged, they knew that, and that's why that part was there.
That's really good. Yeah. So whether it's a guitar or something, knowing to kind of keep that feeling in, but so maybe that guitar, we're like you talked about ahead of time when we're mixing it, we're at front of house and we're listening to the tone, knowing that this guitar is going to be taking essentially a back seat to the synth. We're gonna EQ that guitar, or make sure that tone is, again, maybe a little bit darker, so it's not as obvious and doesn't stand out as much, so that the brightness of that synth can really cut through.
You probably didn't see this, but there's a shelf at 5K on the guitar down 6 dB.
Oh, well, there you go.
Yeah.
That's really good.
If
Awesome.
we turn that on, let's listen to it with the shelf off. Just looping guitar. Here it comes. So they definitely fight against each other.
Yeah, you could really hear it there when you took that shelf off. Just a little bit of that high end really grabs our attention really quick because we're so sensitive up there. Yeah. So cool. So we've talked about drums, we've talked about EQ, we've talked about verb, and getting all these things going together. Now I just want to talk about the role of active mixing and actually blending the instruments, but knowing when to pull in and pull out and to push the level a little bit, but then when to pull out. I mean,
Are you suggesting we touch the faders again?
I mean, yes, that might be is that doable? I mean, can you be inconvenienced to touch the faders?
The faders back in the day used to be knobs.
Oh, that's the problem.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, big time. So, like we've been talking about, the experience being immersive, a part of the way to help that along is, I believe that live sound, you have to go one click lower and one click higher in both directions. So when there's a low point, we want to go really low, and when there's a high point, you want to go one click higher. Because if you can, I noticed the change, maybe no one else really did, because we do this for a living and we hear the most minute changes. So what I like to do is emphasize things like drum fills, like guitar solos, the occasional delay, but very occasional, things like that. And I want the worship experience, and so does the band, so does everyone, it to be a journey, like to enter in God's presence. It usually isn't open the doors, first song, and by the first chorus, we are there as a church. It's usually a journey and helping people move along that process. So in the same way, the reason that we don't do 5 upbeat worship songs in a set, and there's high points and low points, there have to be high points and low points here within each song and globally throughout the concert, worship set, whatever it may be. So it's definitely very, very, very active as an art, and then sometimes as a necessity. So if the drum kit is 5 feet behind the vocal mic, and your singer moves out of the way, you should have to move the vocal fader down about 10 dB to compensate, or you just got a new room mic on stage with lots of cymbals in it. So it's both active mixing creatively and technically to avoid things. So it's both.
Yeah, that's really good. And just kind of one more observation. I mean, so we're actively mixing and we're moving things up and down. A lot of folks, they think that they can use compression and things like that to keep everything in this one area. But like you said, you want it to go louder, maybe one click too loud and one click too soft, to create those dynamics, to
Exactly.
enhance those contemplative low points, but then to also really get everybody excited and celebrating why we're here in the first place. So I think if we go back to the entire mix, I mean, what do you have compression on? A little bit on the snare, the bass guitar, and the vocal. that might be it.
Yeah, I think
I
that's
mean,
it.
we're not overdoing it on the effects. We're not overdoing it. You know,
No.
you're gating a little bit on the toms and a little bit on the kick drum, not on the snare.
Yeah.
I mean, we're not overdoing it here. It's really, you know, like we talked about, getting the source right is where all your tone is. And when that's the case, all you should really be able to do is just kind of flow with the song.
Correct, yeah. Everything is definitely set up to be a dynamic mix from the beginning. If everything was limited and squashed and the floors were raised, it would be really difficult to do that. But everything is set up in a way that we can do that. And the songs that they do are set up that way also. Like I said before about the reason there's not 5 songs at 160 BPM, the reason there's high energy songs, low energy songs, and we have to do the same things here. But we're all set up to do that. We just have to actually do it.
That's awesome. What do you think about the idea of, I mean, so we're going to start off with a high energy song. We're going to go somewhere. We're going to, you know, get really excited, and then we're going to go, you know, get to a low point, and maybe we'll end with a high point or whatever. Do you start off with your console at 100%, or do you start off a little bit lower so that you actually have somewhere to go? What's your thought on that?
Definitely, absolutely have somewhere to go, for sure. If for anything, because we don't have that many earplugs. Because if you start out at the loudest point that you're going to be and people are coming from the parking lot into a very loud environment, that's not good. So you definitely, that's strategic, and it's also goes along with the vision of taking people on that journey. So no, I always make sure we're starting at, typically worship set, I want to throw a number on it, but I would say 70%. If our peak is at 100 during the service, we're probably at like a 7. And then depending on what songs are where would depend on when you actually hit that, but definitely not come out guns blazing. Now there are times where it's, hey, this is going to be from the top, it's going to be guns blazing. But that is, again, a strategic move that's communicated, and everybody knows that.
Awesome. Well, so I think, I mean, you know, in talking about the concept of putting together a mix and kind of knowing where we're going to go from the start, we've already got it in our head of, okay, this is what the kick sounds like, this is what the toms sound like. We've also already got it in our head of when the drummer's going to do this tom fill, or when the bass is going to do that walk down, or when the solo is going to kick in, or when the vocals are going to, when all of these different happenings are. And like you said, you're going to feature that when it's appropriate, right? You're going to feature those tom rolls so that they're really huge and big sounding, and then you'll pull them back. And so that just comes by listening to the music and learning it and kind of rehearsing that in your mind. So if you were to mix this live, I mean, I don't know, it'd be interesting to watch how you're adjusting things and as you bring in the effects in and out, and just kind of see how dynamically you control it.
Well, let's do that. Let's just run it from the top, and
Okay.
I'll just mix the whole song so you can kind of get an idea of how much movement's happening, and then we can reset and we can do it to the instrumental too, because the instrumental actually has more dynamic range than this particular song. So we'll do this one for a bit, and then we'll stop, and then we'll go back to the instrumental.
Okay.
Cool. Get set here. Stop. Go to 0. So I'm going to start with the delays down. I usually always start with the delays down, and maybe even the vocal verb return down, because if he exhorts, I usually like to have the verb 5, 6, maybe even 10 dB down, so that if he's going to talk, it's not as distracting with all the verb on it. So just a side note there. And I think we are ready. Let's see what happens.
Thrive, are you ready? Come on! Stand up, let's worship Jesus in this place. We are here for him. Yeah! Put those hands together, come on! Alright, lift your voices. Come on, let's turn it up. We're gonna sing it out for all the world to hear. Oh, 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 oh. There's love for everyone. A new day has begun. Something to shout about. Let it be known that our God saves, our God reigns. We lift you up, oh, let it be known that thou hast come, thou hast won. There's power in his name. Come on, the freedom ring. Let it be known that our God saves, our God reigns. We lift you up, let it be known that love has come, love has won. We lift you up, sing a church, we lift your name. We lift your name up, higher and higher. We lift your name up. We shout your name now, louder and louder. We shout it out now. We lift your name up, higher and higher. We lift your name up. We shout your name now, louder and louder. We shout it out now. Sing, let it be heard. Come on. We lift you up, let it be known. We lift you up, let it be known. And our God saves, our God reigns. We lift you up, let it be known. And our God's come, love has won. We lift you up, we lift you up. Come on, make some noise for yes!
Awesome. So I noticed a few things there. I mean, one, obviously you left the verb out when he was talking. Hey, welcome everybody. Let's all stand. Obviously you don't want a lot of verb in that. In between the little breaks and between the chorus and back to the verse again, they did that little synth thing. You would
Yeah.
ride up that synth because that's everybody goes home humming that line.
Right.
Nee, 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 nee.
And so will everyone in this room for the next week.
Exactly. So but that's why, because, we're featuring that. But if you were to look at, the way that they did it in the studio, they probably used automation, but you can be pretty sure that that automation went up and then it came right back down to kind of feature that part. Then especially, after the chorus and the bridge, kind of when it went to that breakdown, I saw you really bring up the drums and it got really just, shaky in here. It was awesome.
And that's the part that the crowd they're taking over at that point. They're the ones singing. He's hyping the crowd. Okay, you sing it this time. So that's okay, turn the drums in the loop up and really kind of let's get it going and then ramp into that last chorus.
And there's something definitely to be said about, okay, everybody, let's start clapping, and he wants to get the crowd going. You turn up the kick and snare because guess what? That's where everybody needs to clap.
Yeah.
Boom. If they can't hear the snare, there's going to be a lot of people clapping on 1 and 3.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Especially in the South.
Especially in the South.